Hi everyone, and welcome to the Invasive Species Center's webinar series. My name is Megan Lewis, and I am the Business Development Coordinator at the Invasive Species Center, and I'll be your moderator today. The Invasive Species Center is a not-for-profit organization that works to prevent the spread of invasive species in Canada and beyond as well. Before we get started with today's presentation, there are just a few short things I'd like to mention. There will be time for questions at the end of the webinar. So if you have a question that comes up at any time, please type it in the question box and I will read it to the presenter after the webinar. And if you are having technical difficulties at any time through the webinar, please type them in the chat box or send me an email, which you would have received with your registration, and I will try my best to resolve it for you. Lastly, there will be a very brief survey following the webinar. If you could take some time to fill it out, we would really appreciate it. It's quite quick. And just a little plug on our own newsletter here. If you haven't already subscribed to the spread, then please do so. There's lots of up-to-date things on invasive species and lots of good information. So today's webinar is titled Collaborating to Restore Coastal Wetlands Through Invasive Phragmites Control. And I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker, Erik Leyland. So Erik is the Director of the Invasive Species Program in Ontario region for the Nature Conservancy of Canada. He has over 20 years in the field of resource management and habitat restoration with an emphasis on invasive species monitoring and management. And Erik currently leads the delivery of Canada's largest Phragmites control program, which includes special permission from Health Canada to apply herbicide in aquatic environments with a focus on restoring key habitats for species at risk at Long Point, Ontario. So I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Erik Leyland, and I thank him for joining us, and I'll now pass it over to Erik, our expert speaker, for the presentation.
Thank you, Megan. Good afternoon, everyone. Just before I begin, one minor tweak to the title, as the project has been going for a few years now, and we're actually taking a landscape scale approach. So not only are we collaborating to restore coastal wetlands, but we're now working in the key watersheds that feed those coastal wetlands. So I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to speak to the group today. We've been very fortunate to have a wonderful partnership with the Ministry of Natural Resources and recently the Canadian Wildlife Service in delivering what really is a cutting-edge Phragmites control program aimed at benefiting species at risk habitat in the Long Point region in southwestern Ontario. So I'm hoping many of the audience is likely an educated group today about invasive species, but in case this is the first time you've seen Phrag, you can see that this particular in the photo on the right side here, it's a very dense colonizing plant that chokes out much other vegetation, mostly in wetland systems, but it is a very adaptable plant that can take over not only wetland systems, but also terrestrial systems, and in some of the sensitive dune, shoreline, beach habitats, and even invading into some woodlot areas as well. It is a perennial grass, so it grows from the same root system each year and spreads a few different ways, and that's what makes it one of the most challenging plants to work against in Canada. It spreads by the seeds, also the rhizomes, and chunks of stolon as well. So it's a very prolific spreading plant. It is also allelopathic and a high competitor for nutrients with other plants in the ecosystem. There is not much in our native ecosystems that can actually coexist with Phragmites, and which is why it was named Canada's worst invasive plant species by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, actually way back in 2005. So here we are 15 years later, finally coming up with some really effective solutions for dealing with this plant in Canada. Of course, it's not native to to North America. It is a European plant, and of course, being an invasive, there are no natural controls here that are very effective at minimizing its spread. So the area I'm going to talk about today is down in the deep south of the province of Ontario. It's the Long Point region. Long Point is a unique sand spit that sticks out into the middle of Lake Erie. It's a really unique habitat system and a really unique set of species that colonizes that area, that some of which are not found anywhere else in the country. And we started this project for the good reason that a lot of local biologists and ecologists were screaming for some support in dealing with the loss of a number of wildlife habitats and species, including species at risk in this region due to invasion by Phragmites. Basically around 2000 is when the voices were beginning to be heard calling for support to help against this plant. So one of the first steps the Nature Conservancy of Canada took in 2015 as this project was becoming to fruition was to map the extent of Phragmites with the best technology we had available to us at the time. And you can see here, this is a map of Long Point, and the areas in yellow is where we were able to map using orthophotography taken from a low-flying fixed-wing airplane to map Phragmites within the wetlands of the area. And at that time, you can see on the legend of the map that we mapped about 1,328 hectares. And I'm going to ask you to pay attention to that number because I'm going to come back and speak to that later in the presentation. So in 2015, we had about 1,300 hectares. So why Long Point, and why is Long Point so important and drawing all this attention for this large project? Well, the reality is it's one of the few coastal wetlands on the Lake Erie shoreline on both sides of the lake that maintains that natural hydrological connection and pulse. Lake Erie is oriented on a northeast-southwest axis, and so it's very subject to the southwest prevailing winds. And what that means is, being a very shallow lake as well, those winds create these natural sesh events that are very much like a tide in the ocean. And as the wind blows, it blows the water to one end of the lake and essentially piles the water up at that end of the lake, creating sometimes a 5 or 6 foot increase in height of the lake level. And then as the wind switches or subsides, that level drops again quickly. And these changes can happen in a matter of hours within one single day. And so this system is adapted to these types of pulses or these sesh events, and it makes it a really unique system to work in and to understand and study. Also, Long Point has just about every acronym available for a wetland complex applying to it. It's a UNESCO World Biosphere Reserve. It's both an earth and life science ANSI. It's, of course, a provincially significant wetland. It's an internationally recognized Ramsar site. It's an important bird area, and it's home to a number of globally rare vegetation communities. On top of that, of course, it supports approximately 23 species at risk, one of the highest densities in the province. Its position, Long Point, at the south end of Lake Erie, is right center in the middle of the Atlantic and Mississippi flyways for a lot of waterfowl and shorebirds that winter in the south and breed in the northern part of Canada. And so it's a critical stopover location for a lot of these species, both in the spring and the fall, in addition to the resident population of other waterfowl and shorebirds. And one of the most unique things and a really interesting part of the story is the community involvement and support for this type of work. And with that community involvement and support, brought forward an opportunity to truly have a landscape scale impact. And so that brings us to the actual project itself. We now know there's a lot of Phragmites at Long Point. It's a very special area. So how did the project come about and get to where it is today? So back in 2016, the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry led an application to Health Canada's Pest Management Regulatory Agency, which is the federal body that regulates herbicides and pesticides in Canada, to control the Phragmites in aquatic environments. One of our biggest challenges working in Canada against invasive plants growing in wet areas is we don't have a registered herbicide that's considered safe to spray in aquatic environments. This type of work is done just on the other side of Lake Erie on the U.S. side, and has been for several decades using the same product that was proposed for this project, Roundup Custom, which is essentially the active ingredient glyphosate without an added surfactant to it, which is what differentiates it from the available versions of Roundup in Canada at this time. So the project was initiated in 2016 with the Nature Conservancy playing an operational role in delivering the project on behalf of the ministry or in partnership with the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. And NCC has maintained that role each year since 2016 and including moving forward in 2020. There was a lot of agency support for this project too, as many of the experts that were clamoring for support in dealing with these wetlands were from well-respected organizations with excellent technical expertise in wetland management or wildlife management. And that's groups like Ducks Unlimited Canada, Bird Studies Canada, the Long Point Waterfowlers Association, the Long Point World Biosphere Foundation. We received community and financial support from the Long Point Ratepayers Association, and even the local waterfowl hunt clubs that use those areas recognize the impact to their lands and the property, and including groups like the Long Point Company and the Turkey Point Company and all of the other clubs that are part of the coastal wetland community at Long Point. A key part of delivering a project at this scale, particularly if you're going to be applying herbicide in aquatic environments, is a very careful and rigorous monitoring program. And we've been very fortunate to partner with the University of Waterloo and Dr. Rebecca Rudy's lab on monitoring this project before it started and continuing through into 2020. I'm pleased to announce that there are some publications that will be coming forward in the near future to support the work that's been done by Dr. Rudy's lab on this particular project with very positive results. And lastly, and almost as important as the previous bullets, is the strong support from the public to do this work, as well as our Indigenous communities in Ontario, and even neighboring jurisdictions. We received letters of support from state agencies across the other side of Lake Erie, where they're far ahead of us with wetland restoration through invasive Phragmites control. So that brings us to actually getting down to do the work. Once we've acquired all the permits and done all of the background work and undertaken the community information sessions, set up the monitoring teams, it came to actually time to apply the herbicide. And we do that with three main methods. We use a helicopter in some cases where we have large contiguous Phragmites stands that are conducive to aerial treatment. We use the amphibious lightweight tracked Marshmaster that you see on the left, and also a boat system with equipped with the IntelliSpray reel system, which I'll talk more about later. You know, the reality is this work needs to be taken very seriously and is taken very seriously as part of this project. And so we have a lot of species and habitat conservation measures that are built into not only our permit system, but our own best management practices that we apply to the project. And so in order to ensure that we're putting the herbicide where we want to, at the density we want to, and in the way that we want to, we undertake calibration exercises before the project starts each year. And so this is a photo on the right-hand side of the results of the aerial calibration session that MNRF leads annually. And essentially what we do is we lay down a piece of white tape across a runway strip, and we put in a dyed solution into the spray system, and the pilot flies the helicopter at the prescribed height and wind speed, and we look for the pattern that the herbicide is laying down. so that we can be sure that we're achieving things like the correct width, the swath width of the booms of the helicopter, so we're applying it at the width that we intend to. Also, the size of the droplets is very important. So oftentimes when people think about aerial spray programs, they're thinking about a fine mist that is being sprayed from the helicopter, and for this project, that's absolutely not the case. We're actually dropping out very large droplets, and that's for a couple of reasons. Large droplets tend to fall directly below the boom of the helicopter, landing exactly on the target that we're prescribing it for. And they also don't blow around from the prop wash of the helicopter or any wind that might be in place at the time of the actual spraying. And we need to, of course, follow best management practices and also the label conditions for doing this work. So the wind speed must be below 16 kilometers an hour for us to apply the herbicide in any form, whether it's aerial or ground-based. The maximum height that the helicopter can fly above the Phragmites is only 3 meters, so about 10 feet above the plant. So it's a very low and very targeted application. The helicopter pilot is not allowed to fly faster than 60 kilometers an hour to make sure that the droplets are coming out in the density that we want, so that we are having the most impact on the plant with one application, which then minimizes the need for future follow-up applications. And probably the most critical measurement is that droplet size that I mentioned earlier. Making sure that large droplets are falling minimizes the opportunity for off-target impact. The benefit of using aerial treatment is that it provides a really consistent application across the landscape, and we have chosen to use an automated boom system for most years of the aerial application. So we map the Phragmites ahead of time, verify the accuracy of those polygons, and that's given as a GIS shapefile to the helicopter operator, which then is loaded into the spray software on the helicopter. That software then automatically controls the spray booms on the helicopter so that it can account for the height of the helicopter, the speed, and all of those factors. And so it will turn the boom on to spray mode just a split second before we get to the Phragmites polygon and apply that herbicide exactly as we come over the polygon. And then it will turn it off just before we leave that polygon to make sure that there is not any overspray beyond the Phragmites polygon. So it's a very high-tech system, and it works quite well and provides an excellent uniform coverage. However, the reality is not all sites are suitable for aerial application. There could be trees, there could be other values that we want to make sure that we protect, and we need a more precision system, which would be something ground-based. And the last thing I want to mention too is having a highly experienced aerial contractor as part of MNRF's procurement program, making sure that they're very experienced in this type of work also guarantees a high quality outcome. So when you actually download those shape files after the spray treatment, you can make a map that looks like this. And this is actually an example of our 2017 aerial treatment at Turkey Point in the Long Point region. And you can see the flight lines are the orange, and everywhere the boom turned on to spray Phragmites is the yellowish green color. So it's a very accurate, very targeted application and very well tracked, which is extremely helpful for us being able to share the results of the project, report back to our permitting agencies and our partners, and also talk to the public about just how safe, effective, and targeted the work is. Similar to aerial treatment, ground treatment has a number of conservation measures that are very important as well. Of course, we're following all of those same label guidelines. When using a marsh master, there's always 2 operators at all times. So there is one person down below in the cab actually doing the driving of the marsh master. They're both wearing Bluetooth connected hard hats, so they're in live communication at all times, and the exterminator is actually up top spraying for a couple of reasons. One, it gives them a great vantage point for scanning for wildlife to make sure that we're not having any inadvertent interactions with wildlife, but also they simply need to be that high to get above the height of some of the Phragmites at Long Point. We've encountered some stands that are over 6 meters tall. And the reality is the nature of how a marsh master moves through a wetland is very important as a mitigation measure as well. It's very much a slow moving and then a stop and spray and then a slow move ahead again. And it is a diesel powered unit, so it's quite loud. So it does give a lot of opportunity for wildlife to flee from it if they do hear it coming ahead of time. So in combination with the scanning of the driver and the exterminator, it's actually quite a safe practice to undertake in these sensitive habitats. We do try to manage a single pass between each Phragmites stand where absolutely possible. We don't often find wildlife within the dense Phragmites stands, but the opportunity for interacting with wildlife comes when you're traveling between those stands. And so we minimize our pass to one track between those stands, because oftentimes wildlife will take the path of least resistance and use that track left by the marsh master for them to move throughout the wetland as well. And of course, we're avoiding obvious key wildlife features such as stumps and rubble piles and other areas that might support thermal regulating reptiles or overwintering habitats. Again, everything is tracked through GIS. We have a GPS-enabled tablet, and our spray system has a tracking measure every time the trigger is pulled to spray Phragmites plants, so we can record a GPS point every time the trigger is pulled, or if the trigger is being held down every 5 seconds, it will record a point. So we have a very precise way of knowing where we're applying the herbicide, and also the track log of the vehicle itself is monitored. I can actually sit at my desk in the office and watch the work happen live on my computer as the crews are working in the field. It sounds kind of silly, but it's worth pointing out that the herbicide is actually applied directly to the leaves of the plant. Some people do think because it's an aquatic herbicide that it might be applied to the water body itself, which is not the case. It's actually only effective if it's applied directly to the plant. When using any herbicide mix, the quality of water you use is very critical to success and efficacy. And so we have an onboard filtration system with a 100-micron filter that helps filter out any organics. Glyphosate is a great product for using for this type of work because it binds so readily to organic compounds and becomes biologically unavailable in the environment. But that, of course, that works against us if our water is dirty. So we need to make sure we have a very clean water source. Otherwise, the glyphosate simply won't do its job. And one key thing that we now build into all of our contracts and work on this particular project is implying the Ontario Invasive Plant Council's Clean Equipment Protocol for industry. It's a very well-written document, and it ensures that we're not being part of the problem and spreading the rhizomes, seeds, and stolons as we move from project area to project area. We also use a John boat. We have a 20-foot flat-bottom John boat with a marsh motor on it that helps us get through the wetlands. The last couple of years on the project, Lake Erie water levels have been extremely high, so we've got a lot more use out of our John boat spray system. It's very handy for getting in and out where we need to go in these wetlands. And I just want to add that it's very tough work. The contractors that we have doing this work are very dedicated folks. They're actually naturalists and biologists who actually really strongly care about the work they do. And that gives us a great confidence in the quality and the accuracy of the actual herbicide treatment work. And it's also important to note that it's not always fun. This is not a glorious project for the contractor. They're getting out walking, hauling the hose from the IntelliSpray system, and spraying single individual stems where they need to. Some days are 12 to 15 hours long because we need to work within those weather windows that are prescribed by the label. So it's very good to have the best equipment you can possibly afford to do this work, and this is where this IntelliSpray system works. So this is Erik Giles of Giles Restoration Services, who's done the groundwork for us for the last few years. That's the hose for the IntelliSpray system. He has a remote control in his pocket, and that hose reel will actually roll in and out with him as he works by just simply pressing the remote on the button, which is much, much easier than manually pulling and manually winding a hose reel back up into the boat. And the motor on that hose reel is actually strong enough to help pull the exterminator himself. So if there's a steep embankment or something like that, it can actually be a physical aid to get the worker back to the boat safely. Of course, a key part of this has been working with Dr. Rebecca Rudy's lab on monitoring the work, and we look at a whole bunch of different things, of which I'm not going to go into great detail today because that could be a presentation all on its own. But one of the most key things that we're monitoring for is the quality of the surface water. So being Lake Erie, there are some surface water intakes within the project area. And so we have a very rigorous protocol that we've developed in partnership with the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks and the local Haldeman Norfolk Health Unit to make sure that we're ensuring the drinking water safety for local residents. We also, of course, look at the efficacy of the herbicide. So did it actually work? Did it kill the Phragmites the following year? We're measuring the fate of the herbicide, so what happens to it both in the water column and the sediment at the base of the lake or the wetland, and how long does it persist there if it does persist. We're looking at impact to aquatic organisms, so we're looking at the food web from the very beginning of periphyte and rock slime right up through to fish communities and fish habitat. We're looking at the impacts to other vegetation from doing this work. So what happens when we remove the Phragmites? What do we get that replaces it? How long does it come to replace it? And what are the influencing factors towards that, such as Lake Erie water levels or dominant adjacent vegetation types? We participate and contribute our knowledge and experience to the Phragmites Adaptive Management Framework that comes out of the Great Lakes Phragmites Collaborative. It's a fantastic program that I encourage all Phragmites practitioners to contribute and participate in. So there's a lot of different monitoring going on. As a matter of fact, in many years, the monitoring costs greatly exceed the cost of doing the actual application work. By nature of the uniqueness of having this aquatic herbicide, we tend to focus a lot on that part of the project, but really it's an integrated pest management program, which means the herbicide is really just one of the steps in achieving the outcome of a restored wetland. So we'll follow up that herbicide treatment in the overwintering period, usually in the months of December, January, and February, with rolling using our same Marshmaster equipment. In some cases, we will cut the Phragmites if rolling is not an option. And where we can, we try to have a prescribed burn and burn up those dead stalks you see flattened in this photo. That doesn't always work, particularly in high water level years in Lake Erie. It's hard to burn a wetland and hard to burn water, but we do try where we have the appropriate conditions. And this is what it looks like. That's one of the large burns from 2018. It's a private marsh that participated in the project. It really does make a difference if you're able to conduct a prescribed burn. Removing that biomass really speeds up the recolonization of native plants. So I do encourage that where absolutely possible. You know, the reality is in some cases, none of those options are possible. And so we hire young, strong, willing workers to go out and use manual labor techniques, manual cutting techniques using still combi cutters to actually go out and cut the small stands where we can't access it with a Marshmaster or conduct a prescribed burn. I talked at the beginning about the numbers, and if you remember, it was about 1,328 hectares we had mapped back in 2015. After 4 years of application on the project, we've already treated 1,110 hectares, and you can see that's the areas in red on this map. But what is interesting and what has been a unique learning experience is just how much more frag there actually was out there than was mapped in 2015. So even though we've treated the area in red, which should have been about 600 hectares, it actually was near over 1,100 hectares of Phragmites because we've been tracking it so closely with those GPS systems. That leaves about 711 using the 2015 mapping hectares to go. It'll probably be substantially more than 711 hectares. And it's important to note that it actually works. So this is an image of the Long Point Crown Marsh. This is an MNRF owned facility, and you can see the aerial treatment lines in this map where there's a greener, shorter vegetation growing. That is all recolonizing native vegetation, a lot of cattails, arrowhead, and those sorts of things that are emergent wetland species that are recolonizing the site after removal of Phragmites. This picture is a 1.5 years after herbicide treatment. So it really can make a big difference very quickly with very little impact to the environment. The reality is focusing all of our efforts at the peninsulas of Long Point and Turkey Point at the bottom end of the watershed has been a great project to benefit species at risk critical habitats in those areas. But in order to protect it for the long term, we need to start thinking about working inland in the watersheds that feed the Long Point region. And so the major watershed is Big Creek, and we have taken Big Creek and we've divided it up a number of different ways. And you can see there's about 22 sub-watersheds on this map. We've divided that up into phases and are taking a unique phased approach to treating everything upstream of Long Point. The Big Creek watershed is actually quite large. It's about 750 square kilometers. It is entirely within Norfolk County. It does have one town of Delhi. Another unique feature of it is it's primarily a sandy soil. The Norfolk sandplain dominates this area, so it's very loose sandy soils, and there's a lot of sediment transport within the watersheds. It's also unique in that it's dominated by agriculture as the major land ownership, and there is a fairly good network of roads throughout the county. So in order to move inland, we realized we probably couldn't do this all ourselves, and it was important to use our community partners as part of this work. Through the entire coastal project, we've had a group together called the Long Point Phragmites Action Alliance, which is about 25 to 27 members strong. We set up a subcommittee of this group to help us guide the work inland in the watershed. That includes really important organizations like ALICE, Alternative Land Use Services in Norfolk, which is a habitat restoration program that's geared towards agricultural producers. And they could offer a lot of access to the farmers and producers in the Norfolk area and help us promote our program. We received a lot of funding support from Environment and Climate Change Canada through the Canadian Wildlife Service. Our contractor, Giles Restoration Services, was great at advising on how to deliver this work. The Invasive Phragmites Control Center, the Long Point Ratepayers Association, the local conservation authority, many members came together to help us make sure that we were delivering this project as carefully and thoughtfully as possible. And it's important to note that the municipality was on board with this as well and helping us to lead some work. And they brought 3 different divisions to the table, including the drainage division that helps the farmers on agricultural drainage, the roads program, and also their forestry division, which manages a lot of their properties within the county. So with that project team, and the funding support from the Environment and Climate Change Canada, we prepared a plan to deliver the work, and that ended up producing 8 phases, which we thought was probably achievable if we did at least 1 phase per year. We could make our way up the watershed, with the thought that the Phragmites density is likely to lessen as we move farther north through the watershed. So as part of that planning aspect, we put together some timelines for doing the work. Bringing partners together to survey for the Phragmites on these lands was really critical. We had over 700 properties to survey in phase 1 alone, so we needed to lean on partners to survey their land. So the county surveyed their drains and roads and their properties. The Conservation Authority did their lands. We worked closely. We actually hired a staff person to actually lead this part of the project and go out and knock on doors and engage farmers and landowners and talk to them about Phragmites, raise awareness, and promote the project and its support. And in doing that, we also were fortunate to happen along a few community champions who helped get some of their neighbors on board and be spokespersons for the project. And so with the timeline in place, it was really critical to get to work right away. So we developed, we use a program called ArtCollector, which is a GIS-based program that you can use on a smartphone or tablet. And we built a form, a fillable form that can be done live on site when chatting with the landowner, and we can identify the site, the hydrology, whether it's a wet site or a dry site, the access restraints that might exist to get to the site, any special conditions the landowner had, any notes that an exterminator might need to successfully control the site. All of that was built into the ArtCollector app on our phone, and so all of that information was then readily downloadable. We're able to produce reports and run stats and also create maps from that. So it was a really great tool that we were able to share as well with the partners on the project. So with everybody using ArtCollector, it was very effective. So that once that training had been done on ArtCollector, we sent the partners and our staff out to do the field surveys, which took through the middle of April and into May, actually. And after doing some surveys along the roadsides and after talking to landowners, we were able to whittle down some of those numbers, and I'll talk a bit more about that on the next slide. But the other thing that's critical to note on this slide is the communication strategy. When doing this type of work in a broader landscape scale, it's really important to have a strong communication strategy. We've used radio, we've used newspaper ads, we have a website, we have all kinds of different ways that we're reaching out to the community to make them aware of the project and make sure that they can access the project if they are within the phase. So a little bit about what the ArtCollector project actually looks like. So we've assigned colors to the different layers so that we know exactly at a quick glance what each parcel is labeled. So whether a contact has been made with a landowner, and if the contact has been made, whether there's Phragmites, and if the Phragmites is wet or dry. And so all of these different colors mean something to the contractor. When they go out to spray, they know that they need to use Roundup Custom on an aquatic site, but Roundup WeatherMax might be appropriate for a dryland site. Or a parcel with red might say that the landowner was not interested in using chemical control. Or another color might mean that the landowner has the capability of doing the control work themselves, which is an option that we provide to the landowners being in an agricultural landscape. It's really been an effective tool. And so really where we ended up at the end of the day after 2019's phase 1 treatment is a map that looks like this, where we have contacted the landowners that are in yellow here. They have been identified as having Phragmites. They've given us permission to control. We have dots on the map that show exactly where the Phragmites is relating to the property and whether it's wet or dry, or whether we don't know for sure what the hydrology is. And just getting to the stats of how that worked, we started with 704 properties in phase 1 of the project. Almost 300 of them were able to be culled pretty quickly, either because they were residential lots in a town, for example, or we had some local knowledge of the site and we knew, or maybe they were NCC properties and we had surveyed for Phragmites already, so we were able to take 300 of those off the list almost immediately. Then we conducted roadside surveys, literally looking for Phragmites in the ditches and on private land where we could, and we were able to eliminate 257 properties doing that. That left us with 147 parcels that needed to be formally surveyed for Phragmites. And of those 147, 69 we had noted having some Phragmites on them from the roadside. So of the 147, we were successful in getting 105 of those landowners to agree to Phragmites surveys, and ended up having a spray rate of 24 of those 105 parcels. The remaining 81 did not actually have Phragmites on them once we had done a formal survey, or they perhaps did not have invasive Phragmites. There were some parcels that did not give approval to survey, so there are some landowners who are just a bit resistant to this type of programming, despite being offered free of charge. And 20 of them were engaged, but maybe declined to participate. And there were some that we just simply weren't able to get a hold of through any manner. Next steps for this project in 2020 is moving up to phase 2 and 3 in the watershed. So we're over 2,000 parcels for these next 2 phases. We're going to try, hopefully, to engage these landowners in both phases this year. Of course, that's going to be a bit challenging with the COVID-19 restrictions that we have in place now. We aren't able to go out and do the door-to-door knocking that we had done in previous years. So we're trying other ways, including direct mail-outs. We have radio ads, we have newspaper ads, we have the website, we have local coffee shops and bulletin boards where we've posted information. And I think we're going to try some lawn signs on properties where landowners are agreeable and have participated in the project in the past, saying, Phragmites controlled here, see if you're eligible, visit www.longpointphragmites.ca, and hopefully we can drive some local support that way as folks see that other people are participating in their neighborhood. So this project is, this is a bit of a snapshot on the project, and I could go on and on for a long time, but one of the most important things is being able to fund this work and having access to the lands to do the work, and it really simply couldn't have been done without the donors and grantors and the partners that we have here. And this is not by any means a complete list, but OM&RF has been a wonderful partner and lead for the project since day one. Environment and Climate Change Canada has provided not only funding support, but is now an operational partner on the project as well. Ducks Unlimited has been a great supporter of the project. We've received funding support from Wildlife Habitat Canada for several years of the project. We've received funding actually from the other side of the lake, from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services through their North American Waterfowl Conservation Act grant program. Bird Studies Canada has been a funding and operational support partner. The community, through the Long Point Phragmites Action Alliance, has been critical to success in building support and awareness locally. And of course, the landowners who have participated, most of what you see on those maps has been conducted on private land. So it's really a great story of community involvement, grassroots support, and strong leadership on the part of the local landowners. So with there, I think I'll leave it to questions, and that's it for me.
Great, thank you, Erik. So I have a few questions. We'll take see how many we can take, but I think we have a few minutes. So the first question I received is, what sort of non-Phragmites species have you found recovering in areas where control has been the most successful?
I would say we've had, that story is positive and negative. primarily what we see is the taifa communities, so the cattails that were dominating these wetland systems prior to Phragmites invasion. Also the associate emergent communities, so arrowhead, the pondweed, a number of, wild rice, wild celery, those sorts of things are showing up in some areas where they've been dormant for years, and there's a rich seed bank waiting to germinate. The downside of that is we do see some occasional secondary invasions as well. And so we're getting European frog bit in some areas where it's doing well without competition from other plants not being there any longer. So it can go either way, and it's really something that needs to continue to be monitored after you've done a project of this scale and size. You can't just walk away, but you do need to monitor it and potentially augment with additional seeding or potentially even additional control if it's needed for other species.
Great. Questions are coming in now. Another one I can see is wondering if offering yard signs would be helpful on private properties that are participating in treatment. Wondering if offering these yard signs could help to garner support and spread awareness.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion, and we actually had a long conversation about that just yesterday. I think it's something that we're going to really need for the watershed part of the project. We've had great success in the coastal regions with the cottage community at Long Point and the waterfowling communities and things like that. They were an easy sell because it's directly impacted them. In the watersheds, the impacts are less direct, and so it takes a bit more awareness and a bit more, perhaps even a little bit of neighbor influence. So I think the yard sign may very well be a very great tool. So we are looking at having some of those prepared in the near future.
Great, thank you. Next question we have is there anything in particular that has made outreach effective or particularly effective that we could apply to other species?
Sure. I think for me, what we realized quite quickly is Phragmites impacts everyone, but in a different way. And really being able to identify with those people and address how Phragmites impacts them. So for example, for farmers, Phragmites impacts their agricultural drains. It encroaches on their wetter farm sites. It blocks their access to their irrigation ponds. It costs them money in herbicide and control work if they're trying to push it back from the edge of their fields. So that is their direct impact, and that's the type of conversation we would have when dealing with producers or farmers. It's very different for the cottage community where it's impacting their backyard, it's impacting their property values because they oftentimes bought these shoreline properties for the view or the access to the world biosphere, world-renowned wetlands that are adjacent to their property. So it's really about identifying how something impacts your audience and then making sure they understand what they'll gain from a control program.
Great. Next question I can see is, are you aware of the potential of glyphosate-resistant Phragmites with repeated applications?
We are indeed aware that that potential may exist. I think it will take many successive applications to make that happen. There are, in some cases, stubborn populations. The good news is there may be other tools available to deal with some of those, or opportunities for alternate herbicides or alternate control methods that might deal with those stubborn populations that are perhaps appearing resistant. I'm reluctant to say that they are resistant, but may appear that way at first glance. And the other thing I think we hope that this project is going to achieve is not only finding support for an herbicide tool for Canada, but also paving the way so that perhaps a biological control method can come in and do the maintenance for us on those small populations that are left behind or particularly stubborn. I think we've realized from the best science available that biocontrol is not likely to solve the problem at the scale that it is already in Canada. but it could be an excellent maintenance tool to help keep these wetlands in a native condition.
I think we can do a few more here. So the next one I see is, what considerations were made to revegetate control stands of Phragmites to prevent subsequent invasion?
Yeah, so that's a tough one because the scale of the project does not allow for us to, simply replant. It's different than terrestrial invasive control programs where it's very easy to replace what you remove with something native, with a cedar or hand broadcasting or something like that. We have relied primarily on the rich seed bank at the advice of some of the best ecologists in the world. That rich seed bank does exist and recolonize. And I think I showed a photo partway through my presentation that shows that, within 18 months, you almost cannot tell that there was an herbicide control program there. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that those native plants will prevent a secondary invasion. And we have seen some examples where secondary invasion does exist. However, we haven't been at this game long enough to see how long that secondary invasion will actually persist once there is colonizing of native plants. For example, European frogvid is something that we've picked up in the control sites in a number of different areas, but it was there before and it was filling the gaps in between the type of communities, for example. So what we know is that the rich seed bank exists to create the native community dominance that we're looking for. Whether it will actually completely choke out or eradicate or prevent a secondary invasion remains to be seen over more time and more monitoring.
Great. What can coastal wetland landowners do to help prevent the spread of Phragmites when they notice it creeping into the region? And there's a reference here to Pinery Provincial Park, the Lake Huron area.
Right.
Is it possible for conservation authorities to get access to custom herbicide? Are there financial resources available to help with the removal of newly growing stands?
So there's a lot of questions there. So there is resources available, financial resources. There is a huge group called the Ontario Phragmites Working Group that works under the umbrella of the Ontario Invasive Plant Council. And a lot of community groups are already dealing with this exact challenge in their neighborhoods and backyards. There are so many wonderful grassroots organizations that have formed together, written grants, and been supported by a number of organizations to do this work. The biggest challenge to these folks that want to do Phragmites work in aquatic environments where there's standing water is having access to an herbicide that is safe and effective to do that. Right now, this project that we're working on is the only project in the country that has that opportunity. We're hoping that might change sometime in the future, but for now, the limitation is access to an herbicide. But there are other control methods available that are proving to be fairly effective, especially while we have high water levels in the lower Great Lakes. So cutting to drown, the Invasive Phragmites Control Center has shown great leadership in using this method in areas where herbicide is not available. And if you cut the plant 18 to 24 inches at least below the surface of the water, you can effectively drown the plant with a very high efficacy rate. So it's a great tool that's available to all landowners. On smaller scale populations, at Lee Valley Tools, you can buy a raspberry cane cutter and you can go out and cut those stems in front of your cottage yourself. And just make sure that you take those stems and dry them out and burn them or dispose of them appropriately once you do that work. But there are some great options available, especially if you have a small early infestation. Landowners should really try to act on that early infestation. It's really the early detection and rapid response model that is so critical to preventing the costly scale of project like we have at Long Point. I really wish we had gotten on this work 25 years ago because I wouldn't have to give this webinar today.
Okay, and I'll two more questions. So our second last question: has the program explored cut to drown and/or the tarp method?
We have actually. We use cut to drown on the project. There are parts of areas. So one example would be the intake protection zone for the community of Port Rowan at the base of the Long Point Peninsula is 1 kilometer in radius, and therefore it's a large area that does have Phragmites that herbicide is not permitted to be used. And so within that area, we use the cut to drown method. It's been quite successful. Again, I think particularly because we have very high water levels in the lower Great Lakes right now. I encourage folks to get out this year and use that method as much as possible while we have the lake working with us to help control Phragmites.
Great. And last question here is, have you noticed any wildlife returning to the areas that you have successfully controlled Phragmites in? Any recovery of reptiles or differences in the bird population?
Yes, we have actually, and we're just in the process right now of preparing some documents that will support those observations. In particular, at Long Point, we have seen increased use of areas where control has been undertaken by aerial insectivores such as tree swallows and barn swallows in high numbers feeding over controlled frag. And Dr. Rebecca Rudy's lab has been looking at this particular work and has noticed some really significant changes, probably in the insect community associated with the control, which is driving the occurrences of swallows. We received at the Long Point Crown Marsh last year the first record of a Fowler's toad, which is an endangered species, in 16 years at that marsh. Following the control work, we had one singing male last year, and we had a pair this year. So we're seeing species at risk start to use these sites again now that they're being opened up and the habitat is becoming more suitable. Just last week, I was at a control site and saw a spiny soft-shelled turtle using a freshly controlled stand in an area that they haven't been seen in 30 years. So it really is changing. And we've even seen plants come back. There is a control site that was 100% dominated by Phragmites on Long Point, which is now recovering very well in bent spike rush. So some really great success stories starting to emerge now that we're 4 or 5 years into the project and these sites are maturing. So it's really, really encouraging that we're finally getting to the goals that we set out to do about 5 years ago.
Great. Thank you. I think that pretty much ends things off for today. So thank you again. A big thank you to Erik for presenting today. And thank all of you for tuning in with us. We really appreciate it. This webinar was recorded and it will be posted on our website at www.invasivespeciescenter.ca. So you'll be able to find it there shortly. And just a reminder to take a couple minutes if possible to fill out our survey. We really appreciate that. And as a final reminder, our next webinar will be held on July 7th at 1 p.m. And it is the Spotted Lanternfly, Impacts and Research from the USA and Perspectives from Ontario. So we have a panelist of experts, Heather Leach and Julie Urban from Penn State Extension, and Mandy Innes from the Invasive Species Center, our very own. So again, thanks for tuning in. Thank you to Erik, and we'll see you again on July 7th if you choose to tune in.